Hello.
Hi.
Oh, good. So the waiting thing is gone. So I think that means that we're going. I can't tell exactly how many people are in the chat, but I think we're going to wait a minute or so for people to sort of filter in. It's been a while since we've been able to go to a conference with COVID and everything, but it's sort of like that couple minutes while people are filtering in with their coffee.
I miss those small moments where you didn't have to think about just everybody watching you during a conference,
Right.
professional gathering. You could just be sort of milling about and
You can see who's there too,
you could see who's there. Exactly.
but we will do our best.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're supposed to kill a couple minutes. So how's your week?
It's been going well. It's not the week that I thought it was going to be last week.
Oh yeah, we kind of ruined your Thanksgiving, hey?
No, I had a lovely Thanksgiving. I took off Thursday and Friday, and then I wrote my story over the weekend. And
But you spent the holiday weekend reading documents and calling people and
I did. Yeah, yeah. And fortunately, people were very generous with their time,
Mhm.
and they were also reading documents
Right.
over the weekend as well. And
I mean, it's that thing that people joke about it. It's like the Friday afternoon news drop before a holiday. It's like if you want something to sort of not get too much, that you kind of push it out then.
yeah, that was definitely going through my head when we got the news that the permit was denied on Wednesday
Mhm.
morning.
It's
So
not Friday afternoon, but it's right before Thanksgiving.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh, I think we're gonna kind of go ahead. So first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Colin Schultz. I'm the news editor at Hakai Magazine, which, if you're not familiar with the magazine, maybe you found this because you're more interested in the Pebble Mine than the magazine or something. Hakai Magazine is a magazine about coastal science and societies. We run news stories and long-form features and some sort of interesting front of book content about coastal science, ecosystems, environmental science, and then also coastal culture. So the things that sort of unite the world's coast, the things that tie coastal peoples all around the world together. So that's sort of, we have quite a breadth of things that we're interested in and cover. So the Pebble Mine falls into that, of course, because it has, and we'll talk about this a lot, it has very important consequences for the Bristol Bay watershed, the rivers that salmon used to spawn, and the fishery that's very active in the region. So joining me is the person who's been writing about the Pebble Mine for the past year and a bit, is Ashley Braun. She's a writer and editor, and you can find her on Twitter at Ashley Braun if you're looking for her. So briefly, I'm just gonna sort of, Ashley's been covering the mine, and it was sort of an evolving story. It started with sort of a more typical science story. It was a story about a piece of new research. It wasn't wading into the controversy. But over time, her reporting kept leading her down this path to the point where she, I think, became quite well versed in the issues at the heart of the controversy, the heart of the whole issue. And it wound up that things that we were reporting on a year ago about the mine and potential problems and things to look out for would become quite important over time. And they weren't necessarily things that people were covering in detail because they're a little bit niche or they're a little bit too in the scientific weeds, but they proved quite important. So the easiest way to find all of Ashley's stories is on Hakai Magazine. If you just search her name, it'll pull up all of her stories because ever since she started reporting on the Pebble Mine, that's all she's reported on. So it's all there on her bio page. So really briefly, I just wanted to say, sort of outline the goal of this discussion. There are a couple of ways you could go talking about the Pebble Mine. You could talk about the controversy. You could talk about the science. You could talk about the permitting process. Our goal here is to talk about the craft of journalism. So this is more oriented for journalists and practicing journalists or people who are learning to be journalists about how Ashley developed her beat and followed the story through time, rather than going into the nitty-gritty of the political horse race or the details of the permitting process. So that's sort of the goal, is to talk about journalism as a practice. And so if you have any questions throughout, we're going to do a couple of questions from me, and then we're going to have a bit of a Q&A at the end. So if you can submit them via the Q&A tool on Zoom, we'll get them there. So Ashley, really quickly, just so that we're all on the same page, what is the Pebble Mine? When was it first proposed? And what's going on with it now?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So the Pebble Mine is a proposed copper and gold mine located in Southwest Alaska. As you mentioned, it's in the watershed of Bristol Bay, which supports one of the world's last thriving wild sockeye salmon populations. And the reason why this mine has been so controversial is in part its potential placement in this watershed with such an important salmon fishery and such a healthy salmon fishery, while at the same time this deposit of copper is potentially one of the world's largest untapped deposits. So you sort of have those issues weighing against each other. The mine has been discussed in serious ways, roughly starting around 2005. But the company that has been trying to develop it first submitted its Clean Water Act permit application with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in December of 2017. It's gone through that permitting process since then and gone through an environmental review process. And just last week on November 25th, the Army Corps actually issued a rare denial of that permit for the Pebble Mine. And that has basically been sort of creating shockwaves since then.
Something you mentioned to me is that since, I believe it was since the current head of the U.S. Army Corps in Alaska has come in, no major infrastructure has been denied.
That's right.
It's exceptional that this played out the way that it did. So the next sort of intro question I have for you is, when did you start following the story of the Pebble Mine, and sort of what drew you to it?
Yeah, so I had sort of peripherally been tracking or just, sort of tuned in, occasionally reading stories about the Pebble Mine sort of over the last few years. But it was not until Hakai assigned me this sort of quick turnaround assignment on a new research paper that I really started getting into the weeds on this project. And I knew that it had a really long history, and I felt a little bit intimidated about trying to jump into that at first. And so I was just trying to get up to speed as much as I could on the history and the controversy around this project. And when that story first came out that you commissioned, I got a really positive response from a lot of people about that reporting. People on Twitter, people, Bristol Bay fishermen reaching out to me through email, things like that. And one of the emails that I received in response to that story was from someone who was close to the project and who said that I did a good job with this story, but there was sort of more there, and invited me to have a few sort of off the record conversations about the project. And so that really grabbed my interest. I was really starting to learn more about how environmental policy works and in the US, and also just some of the things that this person thought weren't getting enough attention or were sort of issues that I should keep an eye on that would be important later. And to be honest, that those issues were, did in fact prove to be quite important down the line. And
if you could just move your hair off the mic a little bit, we're getting some kind of crackling. But so the question, what you just said there is, so before you wrote about the Pebble Mine, you wrote about all different kinds of things. You've been, in the environmental world for quite a while. So with the first story that you wrote for Hakai, which was about sort of just fish biology, fish genetics, salmon population stuff, it wasn't about the mine per se, it was about the way that salmon behave. So someone reached out to you. And this is sort of the question that I was wondering about, just from a sort of craft perspective, is what was the form of that outreach? Like, you picture someone, coming to a journalist with like a stack of documents, or was it like a tweet just saying, hey, I want to chat, I want to talk to you? How did that outreach come? And then how did you turn it into something?
Yeah, so that outreach came via email through my professional website. This person reached out and invited me to have a conversation. And part of the reason this person felt comfortable speaking with me, in part because they had read some of my stories before and thought that I'd done a good job there, but also this person was able to point to public documents that were sort of in the government, sort of in the public record already, and could say like, hey, you should take a closer look at chapter X on this issue and, learn a little bit more about that there. And all of the information that I'm telling you is essentially in those documents, but there's so much there. There's hundreds, thousands of pages of these documents. And this person was helping me navigate through some of that morass of data.
Because sometimes you get an email, it's like, look at this thing. You're like, what is this? What am I looking for? So they kind of reached out and said, I'm going to help you find things you could find, but I'm going to help you get to the interesting part of it. Mm-hmm. So with this first story about fish biology, and then you started following the mine more closely from these leads, you were kind of like on the beat, right? You were reporting on the Pebble Mine now. You started doing it more consistently for the magazine. What kind of work did you put in? You didn't always have a rolling commission. There was no understanding that like, oh, whenever Ashley feels like writing a story, she can do that. Like, what did you do to keep on top of it? And then to recognize when it was time, when something had happened enough that it was time for a story again?
Yeah, I definitely, once I'd started having those conversations with the source and sort of ended up having a second story that was based on some of the tips that this person had pointed out, which was really taking a closer look at the port that would be built on Cook Inlet that would help support moving supplies in and the metals out of that mine, and just looking at like what those environmental impacts might be. And from there, I set up Google alerts to track mentions of Pebble Mine and Pebble Project, because it's referred to in both ways. And so I was, tracking that through investing in mining websites, writing stories about it, environmental groups, major news outlets, things like that. A lot of regional, a lot of Alaska publications tracking it. And I was also, starting to connect with sources who were just very generous with their time and would give me a lot of background about what I needed to know to really understand this project and this process. In addition, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because of the great interest that was generated in this project, they started a monthly press call. And so I started just regularly tuning into those press calls, and essentially on those calls, it wasn't really like you were getting much of a presentation from the Army Corps. It was more of a round robin, like you and the same 10 journalists from different news outlets were on that call and just asking questions. And I was also listening to the questions that other people were asking. And a lot of them I could tell were very interested in what a lot of those sort of like political horse race aspects of this mine concerned. But there were, sometimes other things that sort of tipped me off to, oh yeah, this is something that I've been tracking too, and it also sort of seems to be important, that kind of a thing. So
you were putting in this sort of legwork with the calls and making reading, even when you didn't have an assignment. Like this was sort of happening in the background, and then you'd say something's happening that we need to update on. So yeah. it was sort of a rolling thing that you were doing in the background. So with the Pebble Mine has been around, as you mentioned at the beginning, for quite a while as a proposal in sort of various iterations. It's a large, contentious, evolving project that's generated a constant sort of trickle of updates. People cover it a lot, as you just mentioned. So with the project getting such regular coverage by local, international outlets, how did you go about trying to find stories that others were overlooking? Because you did manage to do that. So like, what was your sort of approach to that?
For me, I knew that the angle that Hakai likes to take is looking at more of these scientific questions, and looking at sort of the impacts to sort of coastal natural resources, right? So I was kind of keeping an eye out for those things. And one example of that, which some of these sources that I had built sort of noticed something in an administrative document that the EPA had sent in this process, and was like, hey, what's the deal with this? Like, maybe you should take a closer look at it. And that sort of led me to conversations with some fishery scientists, and really going like pretty, a lot more down into the weeds to explore sort of what ended up being a story about a rare and unique class of sockeye salmon that lives in the area where the bulk of the mine's footprint would be. So I would look for some of those opportunities, and that was something that you didn't see a lot of other outlets really getting into the weeds on those things. And another example of that is getting into the weeds a little bit more of what the mine's developer was proposing to offset the damage to wetlands, and looking at the scientific rigor or lack thereof of that proposal.
Which ultimately, the things that we've talked about and that you ended up reporting on, so like the port expansion, the uniqueness of these fish, the compensatory mitigation plan, ended up being quite important in the end, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Army Corps cited the compensatory mitigation plan, as it's called, that the developer submitted. They called it non-compliant with the Clean Water Act. Essentially, it didn't do what it needed to offset the damages from, building this open pit mine in pristine wetlands in a remote part of Alaska.
Mm-hmm. So another sort of craft, this is my last question, and then I think we're going to go to the sort of, if there are any Q&A questions. If you haven't submitted one and you want to know something about this, submit a question and I'll ask Ashley, or try to ask Ashley. So with the craft of trying to get these stories, it can be quite difficult, right? So the Pebble Limited Partnership has got their plan out, and you're trying to report on it. And with big projects like this that often involve lawsuits or various governments at different levels. So in this case, there was the Army Corps, but there was also the EPA, and the EPA is weighing in on the Army Corps, and they don't necessarily want to talk publicly about things that are happening sort of in back channels or through review processes. How did you go about finding people who could knowledgeably weigh in on and analyze these issues for you? Like, how did you find sources that could speak candidly about such a contentious thing with an expert level?
So one of the approaches I took was looking for former regulators who had been either involved with this specific project or had worked in Alaska, was really familiar with the types of issues that I was reporting on. And I found them in part, like sometimes it was just, reading other people's reporting over the years who had found, who had found these sources sort of before. But in one case, I was trying to reach out to a former Army Corps of Engineers regulator. She was retired, and I ended up reaching out on Facebook. And like a month later, she finally replied and was like, "Oh, hey, yeah, let's have a conversation." So I did that. I also ended up reaching out to a former EPA regulator through an organization. I think it's called the Environmental Protection Network, and it's basically a network of former EPA officials, a lot who left after the Trump administration began. Right. And so I got connected with some of those folks in that way.
Right. So it's sort of like, find the person who used to do the thing that you can't talk to, but they still know just as many things. So we do have a question that's pretty related to this. Did you discover any secrecy or obfuscation along the way through your reporting and trying to get information?
So one of the recurring things that I was hearing in my reporting was, and this wasn't coming directly from, because I wasn't able to speak directly with the EPA, which is a known as a cooperating agency. They help the Army Corps through the environmental review and permitting process. But some of these science agencies, I would look at the types of comments that they were making on some of the like environmental impact statements that were done around this project. And you could see some of the essentially like what looks like frustrations where they keep making the same types of critiques of this plan and of the science of this proposal for this mine kind of over and over again. And talking to former EPA regulator, and in some cases, some of these people are still connected to their former colleagues and just sort of like, yeah, they're making these same comments over and over again. And that's got to be extremely frustrating for them that those comments aren't being incorporated into the process. So there definitely were sort of these open-ended questions about how that process was working and whose voices were being elevated in that process or potentially being, played down.
So there's another really good question about finding sources and whose voices get included in stories and these sorts of things, which is obviously a very important topic that I think newsrooms around the world are always kind of looking at. So when you're looking at sort of a set topic or beat like this, how did you go about finding diverse sources? Is it harder because you're sort of focused on this thing and the people are the people at the EPA or whatever? Or is it easier because you're connected and you can start to try to focus on that goal a little bit?
Yeah, I would say it's both. Sometimes easier, sometimes more difficult. In this case, I was definitely aware and trying to be careful about not always elevating sort of white male voices, which can happen a lot. Depending on what the focus of the story was, as much as possible, I was trying to also bring in female voices. And there are also a number of Alaska Native tribes in the Bristol Bay region that use subsistence fishing, who rely on the salmon as well, and connecting with them and making sure that I was hearing their voices. For example, one of the points that they were making when I was reporting on changes that the Trump administration had made to the environmental review process and to sort of the bedrock environmental law in the US was that the process wasn't that great for Native peoples before the Trump administration anyway. And just being clear that they've had frustrations with the way that permitting process and their ability to weigh in on projects that affect them has been going. So I think that is important context to not just be talking to the regulators or the former regulators or the big NGOs that are working on these projects. To really hear some of those more diverse voices and making sure that I was recognizing their identities as well in my reporting.
So just staying for one more minute on this topic of sort of sources and contexts, and you mentioned the Trump administration there. So one of the questions that came up, and I think this is maybe difficult to answer, but I'm curious what you think. So do you, outside of the Trump administration, do you think that there was something particular about trying to talk to the EPA and the Army Corps, et cetera, in this current political moment? Or do you think that the sort of difficulties you have accessing bureaucrats during this sort of process is just inherent to this sort of reporting?
That's a really good question. I understand that even under the Obama administration, that there was a lot more of sort of funneling of communications or sort of controlling the message around certain stories as well. So it's hard for me to know for sure how much of sort of, we're only talking, the Army Corps saying we're only talking to reporters once a month during these press calls, essentially. And whether that was an efficiency thing, whether that was something that was because of the Trump administration or just sort of a broader shift in government communications, it's kind of hard to know.
So I'm just going, we're actually getting quite a few questions. So I'm just kind of trying to pick around at different topics. One thing that I think you could probably speak to quite a lot on this is that the core of these stories that you've been working on are large documents, legalese, a lot of scientific nuance. How did you go about turning those into stories? Like, how did you find a story in a 1,000-page document? Like, how do you create narratives? This is the exact phrasing. How do you create narratives about complex environmental issues? Which is something you had to grapple with.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, gosh, where to start? For some of these cases, reading through all of these documents, I'm looking for what are the threads that not only matter to people, but also matter to the publication that I'm writing for, right? So looking at what are the impacts of this science that has been put out or, sort of documented in this way, in this document, and talking to the people who knew that science really well, and asking them, okay, well, if this is maybe not that big of a deal or something like that. And they're like, no, like sort of getting a sounding board around some of these things. And sometimes I had to sit with these stories for a month, a couple months to really let that percolate and find the narrative as it evolved. And sometimes there would, it would be a source coming back and, there'd be maybe a popular idea about what the story is floating around in other news outlets, but then actually connecting with sort of an elusive source allowed me to, to really like figure out what's going on and sort of debunk some of that stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. And as the editor who worked on all these stories with you, I have one more kind of thing about crafting narratives, which is just focus. Like, we would spend quite a bit of time talking about these stories. You'd be like, all right, well, this is the thing, and this is important, and this is important, this is important. We'd be like, what is our one sentence summary? Like, I would say that every single one of the stories that you ended up doing was crafted as one, maybe two sentences. And then it's like, okay, that's the direction. And then we're going to go from there. But there's a lot of stuff that got left out, or like we're gonna save. One time we cut the bottom off a story. It's like, this is a different story. Like, let's just keep it tight on this issue. So we are getting close to our time. So I'm gonna read the questions real quick and pick one more. Here's a fun, leave them off on the word, what's next, right? So the mine has failed its Clean Water Act permitting process. So now the mine effort goes into a bit of a limbo. There's an appeal, probably. There's things that are coming up next. So where do you see your coverage of this going next? Do you see appeals? Do you see what sort of things are in the future?
Yeah, so the things that I'm thinking about right now, I mean, I know that other outlets are definitely going to be tracking whether the developer files for an appeal of the decision, whether they try to sue the Army Corps over the decision. But one thing that I'm interested in at the moment is efforts to find ways to permanently protect the Bristol Bay watershed. And there are some sort of nascent efforts at the moment that are proposing ways to do that. And so that's, again, sort of me trying to look at what's out there, listening to the sources that I've built over the last year and a half already, and sort of looking at what's next for this region. And this has been around for decades, really, at this point, that since the deposit was really discovered. And it seems like the people in the region are really looking for a way to stop having this question of to build the mine or not build the mine, because there is that possibility sort of down the line. Maybe there's a more friendly administration, maybe there's a different mitigation plan that somehow meets the Clean Water Act standards. And basically their efforts to try to nip that in the bud and just make sure that that doesn't happen. And so I'm interested in looking at the ways that that people are trying to approach that conversation next.
Right. There's two more questions that I think are kind of interesting that I hope we can run a little bit over. You obviously won't be able to go into specifics, but was there, you're looking at documents, you're talking to sources that are close to the project, but you're not naming them, et cetera. Were there times where you ran across information or facts that was really interesting and you wanted to report out, but you couldn't because you had trouble validating them, or there was like a single source kind of thing? Like, did you run into any issues where there was an opinion or something that you just couldn't fact check to your level of confidence?
I feel like I was, well, sure. Yeah. I mean, there were definitely some things I would say that were shared with me off the record about certain topics that were of interest, and those I was never able to find another source that could publicly share some of those details, but I was still, as a result, sort of keeping an eye out for things that were tangentially related to it. But as much as possible, I was trying to, talk to researchers, talk to, environmental permitting experts, lawyers, people like that who would be able to sort of validate some of the opinions that I was hearing or things like that. So, yeah, there was a lot that got left out for sure.
So we have, at the suggestion of the editor-in-chief, we have a question that we think would be good to sort of end on, which is, it's a very odd moment for journalists sort of right now. Do you feel that there's any personal risk in environmental reporting? I know that you did get yelled at some amount of times.
Yeah, I mean, anytime that you are writing on an issue and reporting on an issue that is really heated, I mean, I was really paranoid about getting things wrong. I wanted to make sure that, every word was fact checked and that I was really doing my due diligence on this. So I mean, it was challenging. I had, sort of at least one troll on Twitter who was sort of badgering me about things, and, certainly had some more contested, sort of testy exchanges with some sources as well. So I mean, it definitely takes some amount of steeling yourself and making sure that you're being true to the reporting and where that takes you. And just in general, in the last couple of years, I've been trying to shore up my digital security practices as well. So,
especially when you're dealing with documents and sources and.
Absolutely, yeah, and being sensitive to a source that couldn't speak publicly. Trying to be careful that I'm not putting them or their job at risk. So, definitely something to be aware of.
Yeah, well, I hope that this was an informative and helpful discussion for people. I'm sure Ashley would be happy to take more questions on Twitter, but that is the end of our time. So you can find Ashley at Ashley Braun on Twitter. And if you haven't looked at any of the stories or you want to kind of go back through them, you can find them all on hakaimagazine.com. And the easiest way to find them is just to look for Ashley's name. So thank you.
Thank you.